All right, good afternoon, welcome, and thank you again for joining our virtual educational series. Today we have Jenny West from FamilyMeans of Stillwater, and she will speak on the topic of Dynamics of Dementia, a conversation to better understand how our mind might change as we age, gain more knowledge around different dementia diagnosis, communication tips to empower everyone, and steps to be your very best. Jenny West is the caregiving and aging community educator at FamilyMeans in Stillwater. She is responsible for community awareness and education classes. She facilitates support groups, memory cafes, and is a powerful tools for caregivers, facilitator, and master trainer. Jenny has educated thousands of Twin Cities metropolitan area caregivers in their workplaces and community settings using both evidence-based and original curricula. Jenny will allow a question and answer session at the end of today's session. For our virtual attendees, you can enter your question in our chat box and we'll address them at the end of the presentation today. And all lines will be placed on mute. And I will now turn it over to Jenny.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you to First State Bank and Trust for having me today and for this very important topic, which is just the dynamics of dementia. We're just going to begin with a few stats, especially around Alzheimer's, just to kind of help set the stage. In Minnesota, there are about 88,000, and actually I updated the stats yesterday, and there's actually about 99,000 Minnesotans living with Alzheimer's diagnosis. If you are here in Wisconsin, we actually have about 120,000 individuals living in the state of Wisconsin with an Alzheimer's diagnosis. This is just really important to be aware that oftentimes individuals who are living with a dementia diagnosis is still out in the community and not necessarily in a memory care facility or even a long-term care facility. Some stats also include 1 in 9 individuals over the age of 65 will be diagnosed. And as we age up to 85, 20 years later, there's going to be a 3 in 9 chance that you will be diagnosed with a dementia diagnosis. Although this is alarming, and you'll hear me say this often, I want you to think about that there are still 6 individuals over the age of 69 that are not diagnosed. Oftentimes we think that dementia, everybody will get a dementia diagnosis as we grow older, and in fact that's not true. However, the chances as you live longer, there might be a greater chance. And with those who are living with the disease, you'll see that there's over 245,000 or 250,000 caregivers that are providing that care, which is also really important. And we'll be going over a few of the other stats as we go. So to start off this dementia conversation, I want to give you the official diagnosis of dementia, which is a loss of memory and other thinking abilities that is serious enough to interfere with activities of daily living. Alzheimer's disease is the most common dementia diagnosis. So in fact, especially over today's webinar, we're going to see that dementia is actually the umbrella term. It's the symptoms that people are experiencing that impact their day-to-day life. Underneath that umbrella are specific diagnoses, as you had seen in the previous slide, with Alzheimer's disease being the most common. It's the most known, it's the most researched at this time. Other diagnoses are following suit, but the researchers know the most about Alzheimer's disease. So oftentimes when you see stats, as the previous slide, it oftentimes is related to Alzheimer's disease, and I show that stat because we're going to be learning about other diagnoses, which only increases the numbers that we had just seen. And as previous, dementia is not a part of normal aging. We are constantly breaking down those myths and those barriers that just because you're 85, you may not have a dementia diagnosis. You might, but you also may not. And we really need to listen to our elders on how they are doing and how we can support individuals, whether they have a dementia diagnosis or not in their later years. So just to keep in mind, dementia is that umbrella term. It's the symptoms that somebody is experiencing, and underneath that umbrella is the actual different diagnoses. Currently, right now, there are over 45 different diagnoses underneath that umbrella term of dementia. We won't be going over all of them today, but we will be going over the top few that we know a lot about. And I want to continue to just say it's the symptoms that somebody experiences. So here in this picture of the brain map, it basically just shows you what different lobes are doing inside our brain. You know, you'll see the frontal temporal lobe, the green, it's your emotion, it's your personality, it's your executive functioning. You go to the parietal lobe, which is more about the touch, the sensations. In the back of our lobe, the occipital is actually where our vision is coming from. And then in the temporal lobe as well, the lower one is where that memory and learning is coming from. I like to show a picture of the brain because oftentimes people will jump to the conclusion if they hear the word dementia that somebody does not have, somebody will have memory loss, which is definitely, it can be true, but it is also not true. It all depends on where they start seeing the, in the scans, where the problems might lie. And so if the problems lie in the front of your brain, that's different than in the back of your brain. Dementia doesn't start all over in the brain. It specifically starts in one area. And that's often the signs and the symptoms that we hear from family members saying, oh, I noticed X, Y, and Z about my parent. And so we'll be going into some specific examples, but I do like to show the picture of the brain because we so are focused on that memory loss, but our brain does everything. And so dementia can affect one or more areas of our entire cognitive functioning. As I said before, that frontal temporal is around judgment. You know, we've got some decision making. Maybe we are skipping steps. Maybe we make a poor decision because the sun is really bright today, and so I'm going to go out in t-shirt and shorts, and then I realize, oh, it's actually really cold because it's only 40 degrees here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. You know, I think I know the answer, but I'm not necessarily processing it all. As I said, too, memory is affected, but not always in the very beginning. Communication can definitely have an impact with a dementia diagnosis. And although the person living with the diagnosis may not be able to help, other people around them can support that individual and actually listen to and hear what they are saying. Sometimes our mood and our personality, as well as our movement, can change too with a dementia diagnosis. And oftentimes our visual perception, which people often forget about, can have a really big impact while you're living with a dementia diagnosis. So it's not just memory. There's so much more that's impacted that we really need to listen to the individual who is living with the diagnosis in order to be able to see how we can support them in being better and empower them towards their independence. In this slide, the path to receiving a dementia diagnosis can be quite long. Oftentimes when you might see your medical provider, you know, you might take a blood test, you might do a specific scan, you oftentimes get the result fairly soon after that visit. However, with a dementia diagnosis, although it is progressive, the diagnosis itself takes months and sometimes even years to be aware that something is wrong. It doesn't happen overnight. Again, receiving a dementia diagnosis doesn't happen overnight. Oftentimes, it may be the person's awareness or a family member or a friend's awareness that something isn't quite right, that there's been maybe a subtle change. And so making sure that you're listening to everybody's viewpoints is really important. What I see in my family or in my parents is entirely different than what my sister sees because she lives in California and comes back to Minnesota twice a year. So her input is entirely different, but I still listen to it because she lives with my parents for that weekend that she's home. So she sees them 24 hours a day, where I see my parents on a more regular basis, but I only see them probably for maybe 4 to 6 hours. And so it's very different, but all of that input is very important to listen to. Oftentimes, a primary doctor or even a neurologist will do cognitive testing to see what are the changes. So here's a plug that having a baseline is very, very important on where you're at. And we'll be talking about that later in our webinar on how you can do a memory screening. And then ultimately too, usually CAT scans or MRIs are done to detect the changes in the brain. Again, when we talk to caregivers and their families when they come to FamilyMeans looking for support, we often hear relief of the diagnosis, because then family members start thinking, oh my gosh, a year ago when my dad got a ticket for driving too slow on 36, I wonder if that was a sign. It probably was, because he said he was being as safe as possible. You know, it only happened once, it made sense, but now looking back, that might have been difficult for him to navigate, whether there was construction happening on 36 at that time, or just that people were going so fast that he was driving too slow that he had gotten pulled over. So sometimes we hear that relief. Sometimes we also, it's also a nice opportunity to start providing that education to that family about that specific diagnosis, so that they can support the person who is actually living with the dementia diagnosis itself. So we're going to go into a few of the different diagnoses now. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and we can talk at the very end. We can take those questions. So the first one that we hear often is MCI, which is known as mild cognitive impairment. This diagnosis is actually super interesting because it was under, if you remember my umbrella, it was under the umbrella of dementia, but about 10 years ago, they actually took it out of the dementia umbrella and put it off to its side, because as they were following people who had mild cognitive impairment, 50% of individuals continued to progress into an Alzheimer's diagnosis, but 50% actually stayed where they were at and didn't progress any further than where they were at. And so they couldn't, because a dementia diagnosis is a progression, it's a chronic diagnosis, they couldn't keep MCI underneath the umbrella. They had to take it out and put it under as a neuro diagnosis because of those 50% of individuals that did not change and progress any further. Oftentimes in MCI, the individual can recognize the changes. They can see where their deficits might be, which lets them also try to provide some workarounds, some strategies to help them when they might have that cognitive decline. And so being aware, again, having the diagnosis and having that initial baseline level is really important to see whether there's a progression or not. MCI is not severe enough to, or is severe enough to show on those cognitive tests that may occur, but not severe enough to impact their independence with daily life. There just might be a few more struggles. And one of the examples is having conversations and staying on topic. They might not be able to recall what was just said, or perhaps even what they just read. So again, that strategy can be, I'm going to make sure that I'm concentrating on what I'm reading. I'm going to put a bookmark maybe a page before, and when I pick up this book again, it's going to remind me of where I had left off, and then I can continue to read. So there's a lot of strategies that we can do, and that's one thing that we can help at FamilyMeans is think of those strategies to remain as independent as possible. So the next one is our Alzheimer's disease. As you had seen some of the stats that we had discussed at the very beginning, it is the most known diagnosis under dementia, which is fine. It's often discussed in stages, unlike any other dementia diagnosis. And so some of the different modules have up to 7 stages, but in the past 5 to 6 years, I've seen the changes going down to 3 stages, known as early stage, middle stage, and then late stages of Alzheimer's disease. It's typically an individual will be living with this disease for 4 to 20 years. We have a caregiver at FamilyMeans who has been caring for his wife for 22 years. There's so many different factors, but individuals are living with a dementia diagnosis for a majority of their later years. And so it is something that you can live with. As far as race and gender, African American and Hispanics are known to be diagnosed more with Alzheimer's disease than whites. And we need to be aware of these risk factors, and our healthcare needs and educators, we need to get out into every community to make sure that people have that understanding, because we want to empower individuals who are living with this disease for as long as they can. An example of Alzheimer's disease is difficulty recalling a recent memory or an event, as well as that impaired judgment. And one of the examples that has actually happened that has been shared with us is a grandmother got news that a grandbaby was born at the hospital. And this grandmother was so excited that this baby, was born, that she ran to Target. She picked out a super, cute outfit. And in her excitement of wanting to see this baby, she walked out the door. And so the police assumed that she was shoplifting. And in fact, again, this is kind of those decision making. These are the step processes. She didn't mean to take it. She was just so focused on the end result. She was so focused on seeing this new grandbaby that she took it not knowingly. And so it was resolved. But again, situations like that come up in our community, and we really need to take a step back and not judge, but ask questions when we're assisting individuals, because they may be living with a diagnosis that we're not aware of. The next diagnosis that I want to talk about is early onset Alzheimer's disease. This is very different than early stage Alzheimer's disease. Early onset is in fact growing in numbers, but early onset is actually diagnosed for anyone under the age of 65. So anyone under the age of 65 will be diagnosed with early onset. Anyone over the age of 65 will be diagnosed with an Alzheimer's disease. This diagnosis is highly misdiagnosed, but it is rising in numbers, because oftentimes we see this as, people will say it's a midlife crisis. People will say it's the stress of my job. People aren't thinking of perhaps individuals under the age of 65 with an Alzheimer's diagnosis. And so we will see individuals come to FamilyMeans who perhaps, especially with the pandemic, maybe they were having such a difficult time at their work that they couldn't figure out the online technology, and they actually retired, or they were forced out of their job and fired, which we have heard stories of individuals who just couldn't make that shift or that change in a job that they had done for so long. And so again, it's that red flag. People were thinking, oh, they're just having a midlife crisis, but actually maybe it was the level of stress of learning something new and they weren't able to do it. And so again, we might not obviously think of early onset right away. Maybe somebody might think that it's a mental health disorder, and it could be, but it also could be that early onset. So there's more education happening for individuals under the age of 65, because that's something that we don't necessarily think of. A positive thing, especially being under the age of 65, is that Social Security Administration will now qualify early onset Alzheimer's disease under the Compassionate Allowance Program. And so that is a really important step for those who have been diagnosed at a younger age. We have seen individuals and have supported individuals with this diagnosis even in their late 40s. And so this is a diagnosis that is occurring in our community. Another diagnosis, again, under that dementia umbrella, is vascular dementia, which is essentially caused by a reduced blood flow and total blockage of blood flow to the brain. So I think of vascular dementia as kind of a staircase, if you can imagine. You know, you're living here, perhaps you have that blocked blood flow. There's immediate changes. There is perhaps deficits that occur, whether it's communication, mobility, etc. And then you continue to live, and you may have another stroke, and another impairment may occur, and then you continue to live, and etc. So a vascular dementia, unlike Alzheimer's disease, which is probably a slow and steady progression, vascular dementia is very defiant. We know when that health situation has occurred. We know pretty quickly within that first few hours to first few weeks what are those deficits that are happening, and then we need to know how can we support that individual. If a stroke continues to happen, deficits continue to happen, but sometimes strokes, you may just have one stroke and it's done. Or you might have really small strokes and have that continuous deficit occurring. And so very, very important to be aware. Some of the examples, as I had said, can be language problems. It can be mobility, as well as judgment in your frontal temporal lobes of that executive functioning. And then the next is Lewy bodies dementia. Here in Lewy bodies, it's really important to see that it's essentially some Lewy bodies that are living at the base stem of your brain, as well as into your brain, but it changes your thinking and your memory and your executive functioning. And Lewy bodies is very distinctive because it truly does affect your visual perception, which again is something that we don't necessarily think about. So even today, if you look out your window, the sun is shining, you know, it's a great day. Think about come January when the sun is shining and it's reflecting on a whole bank of snow and how bright it is. Oftentimes the first thing we do is, you know, we want to pull down that shade. For somebody with Lewy bodies dementia, even that the shock of the sun reflecting off of the snow can just be completely blinding. And it may play tricks on somebody's brain, that the visual images that they're getting. I also think of during winter when we look at when we're shopping about in the community and people have those large blackish gray mats to collect the sand and snow. It's pretty easy. We just walk right over them. Somebody with Lewy bodies dementia may actually see that black mat as a hole at your front door. Very, very interesting. And the thing of it is that they won't say there's a hole in front of the door. People will literally walk around that black mat because they don't want to step in the hole because they can't see that depth. And so they won't question it. They'll just walk around it. And so, and I think about this if you have ever shopped at IKEA, on how overwhelming there are about 50,000 ways to exit IKEA and how overwhelming that can be because it's so busy, as well as even being at the Mall of America. The newer part of the Mall of America is all white. The floors are white, the walls are white, but there's a difference because some are glossy, some are matted, some have polka dots in it, but it's very disturbing. It's not a calming environment, Because again, when something is all white, we might not see where the wall ends and the floor begins. And so Lewy bodies really does affect our visual perception as well as our sleep disturbances. This is when, we're not really getting our full REM of sleep, but yet their dreams are so vivid, they actually are starting to act out these dreams because they're just so vivid to them. And so they don't get that quality of sleep that they might need. Another example with Lewy bodies is the potential onset of hallucinations. And for some reason, the hallucinations are typically not very disturbing to the individual at hand. We've had a few different examples from FamilyMeans where one woman kept on seeing small children, but they were actually a joy. And as we kind of dove into her history, she was also a daycare provider. And so seeing those small children was a joy for her, although her husband couldn't see them. But it wasn't a bad hallucination. It wasn't alarming to her. And oftentimes the hallucinations aren't necessarily alarming. They are oftentimes people or individuals that they don't know the name, but oh, so-and-so, or there's somebody sitting here in the room with me, or they're small furry animals, rabbits, birds. And so again, people who are living with a dementia diagnosis are the only individuals who know what their dementia is like and the symptoms that they are having. And we as a community and caregivers and care partners need to ask the questions to say, how can I support you? What can I do for you? What can I do to make your day better without giving up their independence, but yet empowering them to be as independent as possible. And then frontal temporal dementia. Again, in frontal temporal dementia, your memory actually remains very intact. The events, people, places, oftentimes your memory is not affected until later. However, frontal temporal dementia affects your movement, motion, language, as well as your behavior. And a really key example for frontal temporal dementia is your behavior and your impulse control. 1 minute you'll be super happy, and the next minute something has just completely changed and you are completely opposite. Frontal temporal dementia is very hard for the individual to see that they have this diagnosis, because oftentimes it's heard from those family histories of, it's like I don't know this person. It's like he or she has changed overnight. And so that gives the doctor an awareness to say, okay, and oftentimes for the person who's living with the diagnosis is, it wasn't my fault, it was somebody else's. They just can't see their deficits. But yet, when they have impulse control, maybe they are speeding through a red stop sign, but stopping at a red stop light. Maybe they don't see the differences, and so they're doing opposite. And so very important to be aware, again, of each diagnosis under that dementia umbrella. So important, especially with frontal temporal dementia, because some of the oftentimes used drugs that help support the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease will actually affect somebody wrongly with frontal temporal. It's the opposite effect. And so we really want to make sure that you do know that diagnosis. But I'll tell you, it is hard, because in today's society, dementia is still fearful. But again, so important to be aware of the different types of dementia diagnoses, and that symptoms are different for each and every person, as well as the progression of the disease is different for each and every person, depending on when they were diagnosed, their age, their health, etc. So many factors come into play, and it truly is, I don't know, the best thing I think is it's such a slow progression of a diagnosis that things don't change overnight. Things will change over months and over years, but things don't necessarily change overnight. So that initial fear can actually be combated with or paralleled with education for that empowerment to learn as much as you can about the diagnosis that you were given, so you can live your very best life and decide what kind of supports you might need to remain as independent as possible. So those are the diagnoses that we're going to cover today. And here we're just going to kind of go over some warning signs because that's the first thing I hear, especially when we offer memory screenings is, oh, I don't want to take it because I don't want to know. But in fact, if I can remind you, 6 in 9 people over the age of 85 do not have a dementia diagnosis. It's the 3 that might. Dementia is not normal in aging. Not everybody is going to be diagnosed with a dementia diagnosis as we age. And so kind of some symptoms in normal aging is we'll forget names. We might forget an appointment, but we do remember it later. And this is so important to be aware of, especially, and it has probably happened to all of us. We may have forgotten the name of somebody as we wanted to introduce ourselves, but yet as soon as they're gone, or maybe 20 minutes later, we remember that name. That is normal. The dementia symptom or the dementia sign is when that memory loss is starting to disrupt our daily life, that we are actually forgetting. And that could be very important. Maybe we are forgetting to write down our follow-up appointment for a medical appointment, and now our care is going to be disrupted because we're not following through. That's a red flag. That's a warning sign. Sometimes, you know, for normal aging, we are confused by the day of the week, but we can recall it later, or we have strategies set up that we look at our phone to see the date. We look at maybe our wall calendar to know that today is actually Wednesday. We can figure it out. If we have that question, we can look around and figure out pretty quickly. For a dementia warning sign, that confusion with time or place continues to happen more and more. And we'll see this actually happen in a few weeks when we go into our daylight savings and when into our winter months, when it's dark at 6 a.m. and it's dark at 6 p.m., individuals with a dementia diagnosis may have a really hard time knowing, is this daytime or is it nighttime? So again, one of the strategies that we can do when it's daytime, let's put as many lights as we can in our house. And when it's starting to become evening and night, let's start turning off those lights. So it's that visual reminder that, yep, our night is starting to end. We're starting to get ready for our rest. Again, some simple strategies that we can do to help empower individuals with dementia is really important. And then obviously sometimes we have lost things, but oftentimes when you think about the thing you lost last, as soon as you find it, you're like, oh yeah, that's what happened. And you can recall the steps. For a dementia warning sign, they may have misplaced something and they're not able to retrace their steps. Say they put their gallon of milk in the cupboard instead of the fridge. Maybe later when they see that the milk is in the cupboard, they don't question themselves. And again, then that can be a red flag because that can be something harmful. They're not questioning, why is this in an odd place? So again, some kind of normal aging signs and some warning signs with dementia. And here from the Alzheimer's Association is also the 10 warning signs. And we've gone through a couple of them, but kind of those challenges in planning or solving problems is something that maybe they were able to make an apple pie from scratch and from memory. And now maybe their apple pie doesn't turn out because they've forgotten a few steps and in that sequential order. And so kind of being aware of what are the challenges that somebody is having. Trouble understanding those visual images and spatial relationships too is very important. And I'll tell you that carpeted steps can be very difficult, not only for somebody as we age because our vision diminishes, but again, that depth perception of when does that step end and then when does the next step begin. Things that we don't necessarily think of can actually be very difficult for somebody who is living with a dementia diagnosis. New problems with words and speaking or writing. We've all, might have stopped and be like, oh, what was I going to say? What was that word? And oftentimes people might know what we're talking about and somebody might jump in. But for an individual who's living with a dementia diagnosis, they might just lose their train of thought completely and might need more than one word as a reminder. They might need kind of a little summary of what was taking place to kind of get them back to where they were at so that they can continue that conversation. Or sometimes we just have to say, don't worry about it. If it comes back, let us know, join in and tell me later. Because sometimes the frustration when you can't think of a word or you can't think of the reason that you're calling is so overwhelming that they actually might just shut down because they don't know what they wanted to say. Decreased reasoning or poor judgment. We all know, again, as we age, our vision does decrease, and so we do need more light, and we need more time to transition from light to dark places. Again, with driving in the winter or even driving at night might become more difficult for an individual. And sometimes we do see a withdrawal from their work or social activities. We'll see people perhaps no longer wanting to play their favorite card game. Maybe it's bridge because they don't want their partners to know that they can't count as fast as they used to. They might be having difficulties so that they're afraid to share or to show up because somebody might call them out on that. And so again, so important because one of the things that we can do is really maintain our connections in our community that can really help everybody's quality of life. And sometimes with that withdrawal, we'll see that change in that mood or their personality. So moving on to some communication tips and what we can do to help support individuals who are living with a dementia diagnosis is offer choices, but keeping it simple, especially in the morning when you might be groggy and you're starting to wake up. Don't just open up somebody's closet door and say, what do you want to wear today? It's too overwhelming. Too many choices to look at all of those clothes hanging up on hangers or folded in your armoire. Offer either or and be happy with that. Do you want to wear the yellow sweater or the red sweater? Do you want to wear the blue jeans or the khaki jeans? Just giving two choices can really empower somebody to make the decision of what they want to wear today, but not be overwhelming. Oftentimes, we also need to remain calm ourselves in the progression of dementia, especially in the later stages, when communication isn't working, when an individual is not understanding the words we're using, they are going to understand our body language. They're going to understand your facial expression. They're going to do what you do. If you're yelling, perhaps they're going to yell because they're going to mimic you. However, if you can remain calm, you can keep the situation calm. Which is really, really important. Having those routine schedules are also really, really important. The third one is responding to feelings. Sometimes individuals, when they are very, very upset, it's hard to put into words. And so what I have seen and what I have done is, you seem really angry right now. Can I help you? You seem really sad. Can I give you a hug? Trying to help them name their feelings and then bringing them kind of back to that calm so that they can talk to kind of lower their stress level. Hear, agree, and engage is really important too. I always say it's important But you don't always have to agree with somebody, but it's a nice opportunity to say yes and. Yes, you think the Green Bay Packers are the best, and now we're going to go out for lunch. You know, a yes is simply, I hear what you're saying, whether you agree with it or not, and is the redirection. If you want somebody to, you know, be redirected. Yes, I know you're hungry and we eat at 5:30, but let's get a snack right now. You know, we can use yes and as a great communication tool to hear and actually hear and understand what the person is saying, but also redirect to a different place if needed. And then sometimes we do need to create space. Oftentimes, you know, everybody likes their own space. Everybody likes downtime. We don't have to be busy 24/7. And so sometimes we just need to allow space and not be, I always say, not give too much help, not give too little help, but just give the right amount of help. And sometimes that might mean that you have to step away, let somebody else come in and be that support. And ultimately, we always want to offer that reassurance, being reassured to remind that person that they are safe and that you are somebody that wants to help. And here in this slide, this is a constant reminder for me that just because I think maybe that number is 6. Again, somebody else might see that as number 9. And this is really when we start to gather family members and friends, different perceptions on what individuals see. Everybody has a different lens. And so it's really important for us to listen to those different perceptions and to hear people because they might bring new information that maybe you haven't thought of before. So as I had mentioned a few times in our webinar today, at FamilyMeans, we do offer free memory screenings. It's an opportunity to meet with one of our social workers. It's actually like 5 questions, pretty easy, but again, it's that baseline. It looks at your short-term memory and it looks a little bit at your problem solving. And it's just a good baseline. It's a good insight of where you are at. The memory screenings that we do, we do not keep any of the records. The records are sent home with you at that visit. They typically take 10 to 15 minutes. And if you're interested, you can certainly call Deb Newton, one of our social workers in our caregiving and aging, to schedule that appointment with her. Again, so important to understand where your baseline is to actually know if a deficit would occur in 5 years, in 10 years, you know, in 20 years. We've been doing this now for several years, and we still at various community events, and we have, you know, the same people to be like, yep, I'm taking it again this year because I want to make sure I'm where I was at last year, you know. And again, we all know our numbers. We know our height, we know our weight, we know our blood pressure. Knowing your memory screen number as well is equally as important to live your very best. And with that, thank you very much. At this time, we can take any questions that have been in the chat room.
No current questions right now.
Okay. We'll give a couple seconds. If you do have any questions that you want us to address during this webinar, we are happy. I thank you for being here today as well. Would that be good? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
All right, so thank you so much, Jenny. That was a lot of very helpful information. And for those of you still on the virtual presentation, FamilyMeans is a wonderful organization that we have right here in the St. Croix River Valley. So definitely use them as a resource. And again, thank you, Jenny. Thank you to everybody that's joined our virtual educational series today. Hopefully you can all join us on November 10th. We'll have Apex Legacy Consultants talking to us about charitable giving, good way to end the year. And with that, again, thank you everybody, and we will see you next month.